And welcome to the Practice as Research seminar series. Today is all about ethics in practice. We have a slightly different format today to our usual sessions, in that we have a panel discussion, and I'm truly excited to have everybody here. Obviously, I'm privileged enough to know every single one of our speakers, and I know these three speakers particularly well. So it's quite easy for me to be excited already because I know what's coming. And how I've kind of suggested that we do this is that I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the three of them, and to then kind of, demonstrate to you all as to how their work, although different, will interconnect. What I'm going to ask everyone is to just have a very brief introduction to their research that they're going to be talking about. And then we'll have a conversation. And I'm hoping there'll be more of a natural conversation rather than a Q&A session where I'm going to have to ask all the questions. I'm hoping that our speakers will build upon each other's work as well. As always, please do use the chat function to put in any questions if you would like to. I will keep an eye on it. At the same time, please feel free to just come in as well, to raise your hand and join the conversation. This truly is meant to be a discussion. It's called a panel discussion, but it's meant to be a discussion with some people who are panelists, rather than just everybody listening to four people talking. So I'm hoping that this is going to be more of a conversation this time around. So who I've got with me today is in alphabetical order. So there's no order of hierarchy or in any way, but in alphabetical order, I've got Dr. Jo Collins, Dr. Alison Finch, and Áine McAllister. And I'm really excited to have all three of them here. They're all three very good friends of mine, and they have done some really exciting work. So Jo is a practicing coach and senior lecturer in counselling, coaching and mentoring at the Christ Church Canterbury University in Kent. Alison is a registered nurse and a nurse-research-practitioner. She's a cancer nurse, assistant chief nurse at the UCLH and the National Institute for Health Research Academy member. And as you can see already, their background is quite different. And Áine again is again very different background. Áine is a lecturer at UCL, and she's working in the context of languages in education and refugee education. It's truly exciting to have you all three here. I know that you don't necessarily know each other's work very well, and that all of you come from a very different background disciplinary wise, but that is what for me makes this session exciting, because at the end of the day, all of us have to negotiate ethics as we go through our research processes. It doesn't really matter what kind of research we do. And in this particular case, the kinds of things that you have encountered are obviously, to do with the participatory work that you've been doing, with trying to be egalitarian, trying to give voice to people that are minoritized, trying to cover sensitive topics with vulnerable participants. And all of those things are actually going through all three of your work. And that's why I've kind of asked you all to come here, and I'm sure this will be a really exciting hour. So may I ask you all to just very briefly give us an introduction to your work, so we can hear from you first before I launch into the kind of questions that I've got prepared. Jo, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole, for such a lovely introduction, and I'm so excited to be here, so thank you so much for asking. So I'll just say a couple of things about my two most recent projects, and perhaps try and draw some links or make some suggestions about where they might fit with the other panelists as well. So the last sort of most recent things I've been working on were, I think, connected by a theme of being interested in emotion work. So how people respond emotionally to particular phenomena. I and this was actually a project that I did with Nicole, so it was fantastic. We worked with PhD students to understand their sense of belonging sort of through the PhD process, and this was really off the back of a number of studies that came out around sort of 2017, 2018, which pinpointed that actually the PhD can be a particularly challenging time for people in terms of building community and isolation. So some studies sort of pinpointed that as a kind of key challenge with the PhD. And also Katia Levesque's study in Holland, which looked at around 4,000 PhD researchers and found that around a third of those were actually at risk of kind of mental distress or some sort of mental health condition during the course of the PhD. So we kind of built on that context of an interest in PhD students' mental health, and we looked at how PhD students felt that they belonged in their PhD. And it was the way that we investigated this was quite interesting, because we did it through workshops. So we were both kind of running workshops, but we were also researchers in that space as well. So we had a kind of a dual role. And that links to the other project that I wanted to say a little bit about as well, which is, so my most recent piece of work, I am working with informal carers of cancer patients, so sort of friends and family members, which we might sort of see as a kind of a vulnerable group. And I'm looking at whether coaching helps support their well-being. And again, there's a dual role here, because I am a coach, but I'm also a researcher. And actually I found there's some really interesting stuff in nurse practitioner theory that I found really helpful to kind of navigate this. And it's potentially a bit of an ethical conflict. So I'm going to leave that there, if that's okay, by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Jo. And Alison, you may want to come in here straight away, because obviously your work is also around cancer research.
It is indeed, Nicole. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm probably not going to say too much about the nuance of the research topic in today's conversation, but Nicole is right. So by background, I'm a young people's cancer nurse, and I'm going to be foregrounding my PhD research today. And I say my PhD research, but it was very much a collaborative endeavour, and it was a funded project. So it was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and that comes with certain responsibilities for the organisation of the research and for the delivery, as you might expect. And the dynamic I was working within was a very engaged, participatory approach. And within the young people's cancer specialty here in the UK, patient involvement engagement has been a thread for many, many years now within research activity, but it hasn't always extended to more fulsome participation. And so the project itself explored the transition of quite complex chemotherapy and cancer treatment from an inpatient pathway to an ambulatory pathway. And I was interested in building a foundational experiential evidence base about this for the NHS. And the approach taken was a community-based participatory research design, so a participatory action research approach. And for the past 3 years, the project finished some time ago, but still alongside and working with me have been 7 young people, young adults with experience of cancer, but not necessarily experience of this particular cancer pathway, and 2 parents. And they joined me as co-researchers, present and engaged and contributing to every phase of the research, including analysis and now dissemination. So I think relevant to today's conversation really is negotiating that dynamic and embedding that very core principle of democratic knowledge generation but within the context of a PhD, which, as you would appreciate, is about demonstrating not only original knowledge, but also a sense of individuality and independent contribution, and also the inherent responsibilities that perhaps come from a funder. And I'll just close by saying this work was also supported in a non-financial way by two national charities here in the UK, the Teenage Cancer Trust and Young Lives versus Cancer, and they've been very connected with this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Now, as everybody can see already, there is some sort of structure and organization to the chaos that may appear with having three random people come together, because quite naturally from Alison's work, we can lead to Áine's. Alison was talking about the democratic way of empowering people and of doing research together with people. And this is really where Áine's work is coming in. So Áine, do you want to explain what you're doing?
Hi, and thank you very much, Nicole, for asking me to come to speak today. I hope that I have something of value or interest to add to the discussion. I'm certainly find my colleagues' previous two introductions very interesting, and I can see links myself. So I am, as you say, a lecturer in education here in the Intercultural Centre, the International Centre for Intercultural Studies at the IOE. And I also lead a program for highly skilled refugees and asylum seekers, and I lead that program for a charity called Reconnect, who do absolutely amazing tireless work in support of refugees and asylum seekers who are seeking access to higher education. So I would perhaps call myself, if I may, an intercultural poetic inquirer, and I'm really dedicated to centering the narratives of refugees and asylum seekers who are seeking access to higher education in what I would describe as a wider politically hostile context. And in my work, I rely on two methods mainly, and the first one is applied ethnopoetic analysis, which is a linguistic ethnography technique, and in that work I ethnopoetically analyze texts which emerge through critical and intercultural dialogue, and then apply a process of poetic rendering in order to craft participant voiced poems. And I think that technique is relevant today in terms of how it has trained my ear to listen, and and that way of listening, I think, is a very important ethical consideration. Listening ethnopoetically with attention to the poetics and the stories of others, and without imposing normative expectations of what they should sound like. And that listening informs my other, let's call it my other main approach, which is collaborative poetic autoethnography. And it, like the applied ethnopoetic analysis, is rooted in Ferrerian and translanguaging dialogic principles. The collaborative aspect of that work is absolutely key. We work together with participants to analyze dialogues before returning with participants to analyze the poetics inherent in narratives. And my work, I like to think, is kind of underpinned by conditions which recognize and foreground all that my participants know, both linguistically and culturally, and hopefully, I hope that my work, I strive for my work to be restorative, and to create and establish or foreground ways of knowing which are marginalized in our field. So, I think in terms of what that work might be able to contribute to today's discussion would be around the complex questions around whether we assume that anonymity is the good way of working ethically, and how we can go about recognizing our participants as co-authors, how we might consider multiple facets of vulnerability, both how we can be mindful of our participants' vulnerability, but also embrace the practice of vulnerability ourselves, and how we can kind of resist or overcome gatekeeping processes which separate the sharers or the bringers of knowledge from its analysis, and how we can, as I've said before, listen, and also how poetry itself is an ethical stance.
Thank you very much, Áine. So this is a very, very good introduction. Everybody kind of gets a sense of what the kind of work is that you've been doing. I should add, all three of you are using creative methods. Alison didn't say much about that, but her exploration was very much using creative methods as well, using visual materials and photography specifically. And I'm, you know, this is one of the things that I would like to draw out, is I'm kind of looking at what, you know, the things are that you all have been doing and how you had to negotiate the ethics. So I've drawn out from myself 4 areas that would be great if we could discuss around how you navigated the ethics. And one would be around the power and agency and the egalitarian work, especially with things like analysis that Alison and Áine have already kind of hinted at. But I know that Jo has got something to say about that as well, from her research too. So it's all about the power and agency. And that in a way then feeds into the second area of gatekeepers and how easy or how difficult it is to access participants to basically enable the research for yourselves, because we are dealing with gatekeepers. And again, in Alison's case, there was this idea that, well, it was a PhD project, but by allowing or trying to facilitate something that's fully egalitarian, there was resistance in some cases where people are saying, well, you need to demonstrate your own originality, your own individuality. You can't be writing up on a we thing. So we've got, again, you know, that idea of access and gatekeeping. The third area would be the creative methods themselves, and what kind of ethics conundra are emerging from those creative methods. In Áine's case, the poetry work. And Áine, you've already mentioned the voice and the anonymity and co-authorship as part of the poetry. That's really, really important. But it also feeds into Alison's visual materials and Jo's Lego work with the PhD students. And then the final area is that approach of playing several roles in the research environment that you are engaging in, because all of you are doing that. Jo, you said you had the workshops that with the dual purpose of delivering something whilst also collecting data. Alison, you are, you know, doing research as a nurse-research-practitioner. So again, you're playing the role of somebody who's in a nursing profession and who's doing research. And Áine, in your case, it's a similar situation in that you are, you know, connect with the Reconnect program. You are the lecturer on that program. So it's not just working with the people there, but again, trying to deliver a program to them, whilst at the same time collecting data with them and analyzing that data with them. So I think those are the kind of broadly the 4 areas that I would like to kind of, you know, dive into. Again, everybody else in this room who's here, please do feed in with any kinds of questions along the way. I will keep a very good eye on the chat. So do just feed in any questions, and I can bring them into the conversation at any point. But also the 3 of you, please do build upon each other's work. Don't feel like I have to give you turns. You know, please let us try to have a natural conversation about that. And let's start with the gatekeeping, because that's obviously the beginning of the research. The first thing that you do is try to recruit participants, and here we are already, gatekeeping. Jo, I know this is the most recent thing that you've encountered.
Oh, yes, thank you for that. Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a number of different elements to the gatekeeping. So I have been trying to recruit participants for my coaching study. And so I've been doing that by going to kind of online forums and charities, and had a very interesting conversation with Nicole actually about the challenges that I faced with the online forums, where the process of research and sort of trying to recruit via the forum was construed as exploitative. That, you know, these were vulnerable people who you know, had various sort of challenges around caring for loved ones, and actually to be asked to participate in the process of research would be exploiting them whilst these other sorts of conditions were happening. So I didn't get very far on certain kinds of forums, which is very interesting to me. And the other sort of facet of that, I think, as well, and I don't know whether Alison has any thoughts on this as well, was also around how far the cancer had advanced. So one of the things that really interested me in working with carers of cancer patients was what they describe as kind of the peaks and troughs. So people are in treatment, they're out of treatment, and as things progress, some of the gatekeeping was also around the severity of it, and the boundary between coaching and counselling. Because the illness had advanced, would it be more appropriate for participants to receive counselling rather than coaching? And so some of the charity gatekeepers, particularly around sort of palliative and end-of-life care, were asking me this question about, so, you know, why should we you know, recruit or assist you in recruiting for this intervention? Why should this work here? And so that was also around those boundaries between coaching and counselling, and which was the most sort of appropriate form of intervention. And actually potentially both can work, but the research design includes a kind of initial consultation where the participant can kind of have a conversation about, actually, where am I right now, what is coaching, what's counselling, and what would be right for me. So it is kind of inbuilt. So the gatekeeping was very interesting because it forced this kind of attempt by me to be really clear about, actually, what are the benefits of doing coaching and how might this help the participants.
So Jo, if I've understood this kind of accurately, what you were foregrounding for out there was that you were trusting the capacity and the agency of those people to determine for themselves whether coaching or counselling fitted best at that moment in time in terms of their self-appraisal of their situation. And so the gatekeepers were others, were the charity stakeholders. Is that accurate? Yeah,
that's absolutely right. So I ethically, I think it was best to go via the gatekeepers. So that was one ethical decision, was actually how to access people, because posting things, you know, just on a forum there, you know, I felt that was not necessarily considerate of people's feelings. So I wanted to kind of get that permission to make sure that it was the right kind of advert, or it was the right kind of forum, etc., etc. So the gatekeepers were important in that respect, but actually the key bit in a way is that the participants would decide if that was right for them as well. So in effect, they're also gatekeepers in a way. They don't just sort of sign up, but they get this kind of I guess chance to explore where exactly things might help. and where coaching might help them and whether it's appropriate for them. And in fact, a couple of my participants, after having that initial discussion, decided that they were going to go and get counselling. So although they didn't come and work with me in the study, I saw that as a really good outcome, because I think hopefully that reflective conversation helped them in some way think about what they needed there and then.
Thank you, Jo. Alison and Áine, do you want to come in terms of sort of your gatekeeping issues that you have encountered?
So for me, I'm looking at gatekeeping from two ways, and I'm sure everybody else is as well. But I have a gatekeeper because I'm working with vulnerable participants. So someone that I can speak to, someone that I can, take advice from, and make sure that, especially around questions of anonymity, that and be sure. And really, really mindful of how I'm protecting my vulnerable participants. But on the other hand, I don't want to be a gatekeeper. I want to develop my research in such a way that I am not perpetuating, holding my participants at the threshold of higher education when they're trying to get in. Which is what I meant earlier by making sure that I find the best ways not to separate the people who are the holders of the knowledge and who are sharing their knowledge with me. I don't want to separate them from the analysis of that knowledge, which is why I move between applied ethnopoetic analysis and collaborative poetic autoethnography, because there are ways of listening, and applied ethnopoetic analysis is a means of recognition, but I want more than a means of recognition. I want a means of resistance, and I want transformative methods. And so long as we act as gatekeepers and saying, share your knowledge with me in this very participatory way, thank you very much, now I'll go and analyze it, then we are gatekeepers, and not the kind of gatekeepers we really want to be.
So I find myself reflecting on a couple of things, and I also note things in the chat there which I'm not particularly going to respond to at this time, but I'll just share reflections as I was listening to Áine and to Jo sharing their experiences. And I think the context in which I do research and work is a clinical setting. And so often staff are facilitators of recruitment for research, but they're also gatekeepers. And this may be a very kind of obvious example, really, I guess, but what I have found in my experiences, particularly in the young people's cancer setting, that staff colleagues might say they're having a bad time, or they're unwell, or things are quite tough for them right now, as a barrier to entering a conversation about participation. And yet we know from clinical research that young people absolutely want to be asked about opportunities to get involved in research where they can contribute their perspective. So it's working with that dynamic, and also within that to say that we're not looking for those people who are articulate, because you hear time and time again, oh, I think they'd be very good because they're artistic, or they're articulate, or they fit this sense, often colleagues might think, of who might be good to recruit. So that's quite a perhaps less nuanced perspective of gatekeeping. The other example I will offer is that I was working with two parents unrelated to the young people who became co-researchers, and these two parents, they became part of our community of inquiry. And there was a challenge from one about why young people were engaged in peer-to-peer photo-guided interview conversations, and yet the interviews with companions, invariably parents, partners, siblings, were undertaken with me alone. And why would we not have a dynamic where they would peer interview the other companions? So I think, you know, that challenge is really healthy. And what evolved from there was a three-way interview dynamic where I would partner with one of the parent co-researchers, and together we would have this three-way exploratory conversation with the participant. But there was a huge amount of gatekeeping that we had to overcome to get to that point. And the most striking perhaps was from my sort of, you know, academic colleagues around, we don't do 2-on-1 interviews. And there was a lot of resistance early on about the dynamic that might be created. And rather than seeing it as an opportunity for a supportive conversation, and Áine, you talked about that sense of the work being restorative through participation. And one thing that came from this was these companions often felt on the fringes of care delivery, and there hadn't been any space and time for them to articulate their feelings that their participation in the research enabled. But it's that sense of working through sort of normative expectation and values. And the consequence was something that was really, it generated really rich data in community, but also it offered a supportive space for those people who took part.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat box which I'd like to bring in here, because it kind of says one of the issues that appears to happen here is that the problematic use of the term vulnerable, which then kind of necessitates the gatekeepers and facilitates gatekeeping. So how far does the word vulnerable automatically deprive a person of their agency? That's the question. And in many ways, that's exactly what I have said to Joe when we had this discussion recently, where I said it's quite funny, really, because it's a person in the position of power that suggests, well, here is a person who's vulnerable.
But could I come in there at this point, if that would be okay? I just think that's really, really important for me as well, in that I, you know, paying a lot of attention to my own practice of vulnerability to try and disrupt those relationships of who's vulnerable, and I know that it's a privilege to be able to decide to be vulnerable. So we need to recognize that I'm in a privileged position of just being able to decide that I will practice vulnerability, but I still think that it's required of me to recognize, and it is actually true, that I don't know as much as my participants know, so I want to come with that attitude so that I can disrupt those power dynamics, and be always, you know, critically kind of reflective and asking myself, am I making sure that I'm not continuing an unequal power dynamic, to address that issue, to undo some of that imposed vulnerability.
I think that's exactly the kind of issue that Joe specifically was encountering, where the gatekeepers were saying, you know, well, our participants are vulnerable, you can't post and ask for research participants, and actually is then taking away that agency from the participants. And that's a comment in the chat box as well, where it says, to me, it highlights the importance of distinguishing sympathy and empathy. if someone is protecting a potential participant out of sympathy, it might not be what they actually want. So the question is, how can we continue to provide people with options and respect their agency? Jo, have you been able to overcome that conundrum yet, or are you still grappling with it?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think in part the agency is inbuilt into the research design. So like I was saying, having that initial consultation. I also think there's something here around how we posit vulnerability. It's a fairly sort of blanket term that doesn't recognize the specificities of people's situations. So in the sort of encounters that I had, it's kind of around that idea of distress, and that these people may be too distressed to be able to participate in the research. But actually, quite interestingly, when I was doing a focus group with my participants, other forms of vulnerability emerged around caregiving and finances and, you know, socio-economic aspects as well. So there's something there about that it's not a pre-given group, in a way, that there are all these intersecting complexities about that vulnerability. And actually, perhaps what I want to say is less about agency in terms of recruitment, but agency in terms of the coaching intervention. Because in that space, one of the things that came out for the focus group participants was that they would like a space in which actually they're able to reflect on and express and even formulate that vulnerability. And the coaching space can be that space where they're able to talk about the different things that are actually happening for them and kind of process it with somebody who's not kind of close to the situation. So in terms of the recruitment, I think it might be about diversifying the different approaches. So how do I reach people? I'm still thinking about that. So I'm trying hospices, charities, and Facebook groups, and there's probably something that I've missed. I've got participants like blanketing posters in GPs and things like that. So I'm hoping that it will get out there. And I think there's probably still some more to think about, but I also think that that agency, the gatekeeping element, is also very important for the gatekeepers. Like the hospices, for example, interviewed me as part of their ethical process to make sure that they were working ethically with not just the people they care for, but their families as well, who they also saw as service providers. So there was a kind of positive aspect to that, I think, as well.
Thank you. I know we've been talking a little bit about power and agency now already, so we've kind of moved away from gatekeeping into the power and agency quite naturally. And I'd like to bring in a question here, Áine, to you specifically, which is from the chat box, and which is really about that power and agency. And the question is, if you could talk a little bit more about the ethics of translating participants' language into English for the purpose of data collection and analysis. So, you know, things like what's lost in the process. Are there any ways you can include non-English languages, ways of thinking into your work, into the Poetic Inquiry? And is there any kind of opportunity? And again, in many ways, the reason I'm bringing in this now is obviously this is more about agency and about hearing those minoritized and marginalized voices. Áine.
This is absolutely central to my approach. That's a translanguaging perspective, which is not just about facilitating participants to move between languages or creating a space in which different languages can be used, although I do try to do that. But it's also about recognizing that people know things and can make sense of things not just through language, which is where visual methods also come in. So we start with image, the construction of photographic images, and we move to the dialogic analysis of that. But we create dialogic spaces in which people can draw on their different linguistic and cultural knowledge. So we often arrive at concepts which are not translatable into English, and we then discuss those to arrive at a definition of them. But it is a concept which the participants recognize culturally, and that informs and makes the work richer. Or it may be that we draw on a form from another language, a poetic form from another language, and that informs our work. It depends on the group that I'm working with, but absolutely we try to create a space in which we move across language and culture and ways of knowing and means of making meaning, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Áine. And in many ways, that leads quite nicely to Alison's work. Alison, could you talk a little bit about the creative approaches that you've used in your research? Because in many ways, that's also about making meaning and making sense of lived experiences and using other ways of knowing.
Thank you, Nicole. So the most I guess the clearest thing to offer perhaps is to understand these young people's experience of this particular cancer pathway. The word interview, I think, for younger people conjures up all sorts of things, not least this sense of formality and of judgment. So very early on, as a community, we were keen to try and create a space for a conversation that very much kept the anticipation, choice, and options of what that conversation would look like and the form that it would be with those young people who were taking part. And I'd actually met Nicole. We happened to sit next to each other at a Social Research Association conference many years ago now, with our lunch balanced on our knee. And that led to a conversation around working with photographs and with images. And what that led to is that the young people who took part in this research, they took a series of photographs that depicted different aspects of their experience, and then they brought those to what had been intended to be in person but became an online conversation with one of the young adult co-researchers, and it was a peer to peer conversation. And although clearly some people are more visual than others, and some people may respond to the idea of working and discussing images than others, what it did do is it very much fulfilled those aims of that young person having a sense of what this conversation would be about, having a sense of choice about what they would bring to that conversation. So yes, the co-researcher facilitating that would use this as a basis for inquiry and for further questions, but what it retained is that younger person's agency within the conversation. And so the other thing really was that this, a few years ago, was all quite new to me, in all honesty. So at the time I had seen that these photographs would be a conduit for this conversation. So they would be a facilitator for this aim of retaining the young person's agency. But very quickly we realized that the images were data in and of themselves, and so that led to the images and the narrative being analysed as a community of co-researchers together.
Thank you. And I know that the ethics around negotiating that was not necessarily easy for you. I do know that too. Also, I would like to bring in at this stage, Joe and I, like Joe said earlier, we did some Lego workshop with participants, and that has, you know, some really interesting aspects, because with the photographs, you can kind of see how the people that are taking the photographs, they own those photographs because it's their photographs, it's their camera. And yes, they can send you the image and you may be able to use it. And that's the same, I suppose, with the poetry in Áine's work, where you can have people, you know, like have their names attached to the poem, and you're allowed to use and recite that poem, but ultimately it's their work. With the Lego work that Joe and I have been doing, it's kind of a little bit difficult because it was my Lego or Joe's Lego in a different project. So we owned the pieces and the people owned the model. So whose thing is it in the end, you know? And it feels quite mean, didn't it, Joe, to tell people, right, and now you've got to dismantle it.
Yeah, I remember we were like, photograph it first, record it.
Yes.
And actually, one of the things that we did do is we got some funding, didn't we, Nicole? So we were able to put together these little packets of Lego so people could actually go away and build their own models. I think that was the next logical step that came out of it.
Yes. So there is one question that I'd like to raise. I mean, I'm quite aware of the time. You know, you'll be surprised that we're nearly done with the hour. So we've obviously not covered all of it, but I want to make sure that this one question from the floor gets asked. The question is, and that's kind of aimed at all three of you, have you ever felt vulnerable as researchers while researching or being with your participants or co-researchers? And if yes, how did you navigate your vulnerable position as researchers? Now, obviously, this is asking you to be quite publicly vulnerable in your own way, because you have to kind of admit to that vulnerability. But at the same time, I think it's very, very important to recognize that I would suggest everybody feels vulnerable when they're doing research at one point or another. So, you know, for everyone in the room, I'm speaking for myself here as well. I do think that all of us feel, you know, vulnerable at one point in our work. But please, you know, the question is raised to the three of you. Did you feel vulnerable? In which way? And how were you able to navigate that? Who's
I'm happy to start, Joe, if that's all right. So I think there's something inherently vulnerable about being a coach, as well as a researcher, and that duality of, so in the coaching space, the idea is that you are guided by the agenda of, you know, the person coming for coaching, but obviously you've got the researching interest as well. And then within the coaching space itself, you're kind of undertaking a series of kind of decisions about what questions are you going to ask? How are you going to respond to that? And so your kind of, I guess, empathy as a coach is really, really important here. And in the coaching space, you know, you might make mistakes, you might not ask the right question in the right way, or you might tap into something, particularly if you're working with people who are caring and there's some difficult things in that situation, you might tap into that, and that actually you know, might then lead to the coaching session perhaps unraveling in some sort of way. And there's another very personal element of vulnerability that comes into my research, because I chose to do this research as somebody who has a partner with cancer. So there is a kind of personal connection in terms of the situation that I'm in and the situation that my coachees are in. And so that really makes that coaching space a tricky one to navigate, because I find myself wanting to share things that have happened to me, that I can empathize with that person because, you know, this situation and that situation. But in the coaching space, you're supposed to put your client first. resist and not share. So it actually, there's some interesting questions about how you coach in that situation. And I'm not sure I've decided yet whether sharing and being vulnerable, does that help or does it not? And I'm not sure there's a blanket answer to that. I think it's very contingent and circumstance specific.
I agree with you. I would suggest that in my own research, a lot of people are asking me, well, why are you researching that topic or this topic? And a lot of the times we are researching the topics that are dear to us for some reason or other. So, you know, when you then enter that space, you know, by default, you know, when participants ask you, well, how do you respond to that? You know, that's quite a difficult one. Alison and Áine, do you want to come in about the vulnerability?
Shall I go? Or
yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So just, I think some of that vulnerability also builds receptiveness. And Nicole, you just mentioned there about researching areas that are dear to us. But I think what that comes with, which is perhaps a positive and contributory to the space, is that sort of a heightened sense of receptiveness. So I was just thinking there about my own sort of personal experience of vulnerability. And many years ago, I would be a bedside nurse and I would be looking after, on a day-to-day basis, people with cancer. And in more recent years, I've been in a leadership role within my organisation. So there's been some, I guess, some clinical distancing. And the research took me back to being very close to participants and to the world. And I think what struck me was just the precarious and very uncertain nature of these young people and their families' lives that I found quite, it was a very emotionally charged for me. And it made me reflect on my own vulnerability in that space, but also my own sense of responsibility, because as a researcher, I'm also a nurse, and that's very known to the community and to the participants taking part. And so I guess it required me to be, and I wanted to be, relationally connected, because as a nurse, you are, you know, the basis for your work is that relational connection with others. But within that, to be acutely mindful of, the word boundaries is a bit too trite, but that sense of the purpose for the being there. And I found that quite tricky to negotiate at times. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Áine.
Well, something I think about a lot, obviously. That's why we're all here, because we're all thinking about that.
Yes.
I think I need to make myself vulnerable. And as well as being aware while caring for my participants' vulnerability. I think I don't try not to be vulnerable. I am aware that I need I want to disrupt power, and also I am aware that I don't know. And it's not fair that I'm in a position which assumes that I know, and when I'm dealing with people who often are much more accomplished than I am, but are excluded and silenced and have vulnerability imposed upon them. So I should not try to resist whatever ways in which I'm vulnerable. But I can't do that to such an extent that it becomes a burden on my participants. That's just a kind of balance that I'm trying to navigate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all three of you. I think this is a really, really nice way of kind of ending that conversation that we've had. I should like to say thank you to everyone who's contributed with questions. There's a couple of more comments in the chat box. So somebody saying thank you very much. Somebody else saying absolutely, Alison, I share your thoughts and experiences as a pharmacist and researcher. Thank you so much. Really interesting to hear from you all. So you obviously get the love here from the room. It's really exciting to kind of have had this conversation. One thing, and again, you know, I knew that we were going to easily fill many more hours, but what I would like to share very quickly is just a look ahead to the next session that we've got planned, which is going to happen on the 3rd of May. And there is the link to the Eventbrite registration form in the chat box as well. This is going to be about ethical guidelines for the educational research in the changing world. And we are then also going to look at, you know, one more slide here very quickly, where you have all of the links to the PAR YouTube channel, the Buzzsprout channel, etc., etc. This is really just for you to kind of, you know, catch up on some of the recordings in case you haven't been able to catch all of the sessions. Again, I would like to say thank you very much, Alison, Joe and Áine. It's been a great pleasure. It's been really exciting to have you all.